Also, there can be emotional neglect where parents either are too busy or have their own issues. You don't have to have actually been the victim of a trauma to be traumatized. Hi, this is Jim Brillon. Welcome to my YouTube channel where we talk about all things mental health. Today I'm going to be talking about childhood trauma, what it is, how it happens, how it affects people, and also how it can be addressed and healed. Childhood trauma is something that many people that get into therapy for various issues eventually start to understand that trauma from their childhood is actually an underlying cause of a lot of their mental health challenges. One of the ways that we identified childhood trauma is through something that's called ACEs, A-C-E, that stands for Adverse Childhood Events. Adverse childhood events could be various forms of abuse and neglect. There are four basic types of them. There's abuse and neglect. There's also household dysfunction and something called community incidents. So abuse and neglect, I think, is fairly well understood. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Neglect is when a child doesn't have their basic needs. They don't have enough food or adequate shelter. Also, there can be emotional neglect where parents either are too busy or have their own issues that they can't focus on caring for their children appropriately. The household dysfunctions are things when there's a parent or a couple of parents that are addicted to a substance or maybe have their own mental health issues to deal with. Also, living in extreme poverty or dangerous areas where your physical safety is always a concern. And then community incidents, this is things in the broader community, like, you know, do you live in an area of the country or in a country that's just not safe? If there's violence that happens in the streets, you know, every time you walk out the front door, you know, you don't know if you're going to be shot at or if there's going to be some kind of, you know, crime that you're going to be subjected to. When we look at ACEs and identifying people's vulnerability to trauma and the after effects, some of the statistics are actually kind of scary because 61% of the population in the United States has at least one adverse childhood event, and about 16% of the population has at least 4 of them. And when you start adding those things up, you start exponentially increasing the risk of mental health challenges, of physical health challenges. Trauma impacts different people differently, and it impacts females and minorities to a greater extent. There's different ways to identify influences of trauma. First of all, you look at how serious were the events. You know, were you physically hurt? Was your life in danger? Did you lose someone? And depending on the developmental stage of the child, these impacts can have much more serious after effects. You look at how close was the trauma to you. Were you a victim, or did you witness it, or did you learn about it? And all of those things they can all cause trauma. You don't have to have actually been the victim of a trauma to be traumatized. Even as a child, learning about it or seeing it happen to another person can really impact the developing brain of a child and the nervous system. And that's really what happens with childhood trauma, is the nervous system changes. There are effects that happen in the nervous system, in the brain, and also in the body, because trauma is lodged in the body. Other ways that we look at the influences of these adverse childhood events is, so we also look at, was there previous trauma? You know, was there trauma that happened before that? And also, how did your caregivers react? And this is a huge part of it. If you had caregivers that reacted in a way that you felt understood, cared for, and your parents, your caregivers attuned to you, then you can keep your sense of trust and acceptance and feeling loved and cared for, and you can prepare to cope with it. What's really, really damaging is when your caregivers are actually the people who are abusing you. That's something that a childhood brain just can't understand, can't make sense of. And the things we can't make sense of often lead to trauma because we're affected emotionally, psychologically, but we don't actually have a narrative that makes sense of it all. And that's one aspect of what leads to trauma. There are long-term effects of trauma, and when you start looking at it, it's really kind of frightening because it affects the brain, the body. There are neurochemical changes, the way that the body releases neurotransmitters and various chemicals in the body. There are biological reactions, and the body tries to get back to they call it allostasis, meaning after there's a traumatic disruption, the body tries to get back to a level of normality, but there are often ripple effects that happen. Some of the health risks can be heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, obesity, addiction. It's estimated that at least 4 of the major causes of death in our country can be traced back to childhood trauma, the effects of childhood trauma. Other ways that trauma in childhood affects the person for the rest of their life can be emotional danger. It can lead to anger and aggression. Some of the 2 biggest effects of it are depression and anxiety. Also, changes in appetite, low self-esteem can lead you to have recurrent thoughts of death or even suicide, and can lead to self-destructive behavior. It contributes to something called ANHEDONIA, where it's a component of depression where you just lose interest in things that you used to care about. And the main thing is that it disrupts the ability of the person to trust in other people, to trust that the world is a safe place, to trust that people will be there for me, to trust that it's safe to be in a relationship, and sometimes to trust in themselves. And a child who's been traumatized is much more susceptible to having a trauma bond, meaning that that childhood trauma sets them up to be vulnerable to being re-traumatized again by a narcissistic relationship. It can set them up for things like what we think of as love addiction or relationship addiction, where the person has to be in a relationship and doesn't feel safe or connected if they're not. And even when they're in the relationship, they're not really fully safe. There can be risks to life functioning as a result of childhood trauma, including job performance, poor job performance, problems in relationship, difficulty even keeping routines, accomplishing tasks, and poor academic performance. So there's just a litany of issues that childhood trauma can lead to, because it basically disrupts the development of a child. And unfortunately, this is often a transgenerational pattern, because the trauma is repeated from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, until somebody has the wherewithal and frankly the courage to stand up and say, I'm not going to pass this on to my children. And that takes a lot of courage, and it takes the right kind of help as well. Something to be aware of when we talk about trauma in general is we talk about capital T and little t traumas. Capital T traumas are the things that most people think of as trauma. Trauma that happens in a war situation, or a physical assault or a sexual assault. Those are sometimes called shock trauma or single event traumas. But there's also something that we think of as little t trauma, and those are the smaller events that happen more repeatedly, like abuse, neglect, problems connecting and attaching to a caregiver, and attachment is a huge area of childhood trauma. Attachment is what happens with a child, how they bond with their early caregivers, and somebody who attaches successfully and securely grows up to feel that the world is safe, and I can be aware of dangers and risks, but being in a relationship is safe, and it's safe to be vulnerable with other people. If we don't attach securely, we attach insecurely, and people can end up being preoccupied with what's going on in your mind, where they can't actually be present in a relationship, or they can be just constantly anxious about the relationship. Anxious and preoccupied or disorganized attachment is a really important area to look at with childhood trauma. It's a huge component of developmental trauma, and often it leads to intimacy disorders, where somebody could even have a very successful life, and in every other element of their life, life works for them. They can have a great career, they can, graduate college, but when it comes to interpersonal relationships, all of that the attachment stuff gets activated, and there can be avoidance behaviors, clinging behaviors. It can lead to codependence. So the attachment component is a huge part of healing childhood trauma. So that's kind of a scary list of things, but the truth is that there are ways to heal it, and there are effective trauma therapies. Any kind of therapy working with a victim of trauma has to be trauma informed. In other words, the therapist needs to understand that some of the symptoms or behaviors that they're recognizing may not always be ADD or ADHD or simply depression, anxiety. It may not be bipolar disorder. It could actually be a trauma effect. And being informed about trauma and how it affects the brain and the nervous system and behaviors is really, really important. Any trauma treatment really has to also focus on the limbic system in the brain. The limbic system is the part of the brain that's impacted. Just in brief, if you think of like this as a model of the human brain, this is our brain and this is our spinal cord. We have an old reptile part of the brain which regulates, our breathing and perspiration and temperature and all that. And in the center of our brain, we have an area called the limbic system. This is the seat of emotions, fear, our fight, flight, freeze mechanism. And then we have the outer part of the brain that you see in pictures of a brain, where all the grooves and where all the executive functions happen. When somebody is traumatized, this part of the brain is traumatized, and this part of the brain where we can make rational decisions and problem solve and create language and narratives, this part of the brain literally goes offline. It's sort of like you flip your lid. You hear people say that I was so scared or so angry that I couldn't think straight, and this is true. An effective trauma treatment helps to integrate these two parts of the brain and bring them back into a working relationship. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a terrible title, but it's a fantastic trauma resolution therapy. Is one of the most effective ways of integrating the brain, and also various forms of somatic therapies focusing on the sensations in the body and not just thoughts. So it's important to recognize that childhood trauma can lead to effects on memory, impairing information processing, can lead to inflammation in the body, and whether we can regulate or not regulate our emotions. PTSD is something that most people recognize as a symptom of trauma. Complex or C PTSD is the attachment trauma, the intimacy disorders, and those types of traumas. And often when the trauma happens before a child is 3 or so, before they've actually developed narrative memory, they may not actually have memories of the trauma happening, but their body remembers it because the body does remember traumatic events, and it can be stored in the body in the form of hypervigilance, always being on alert. And literally the way that our nervous system responds to another person. That hypervigilance can often be like you constantly have one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake, where your nervous system is revved up, but you have a fear response at the same time. And anybody who's living with trauma can probably relate to those experiences. It can lead to what we call experiential avoidance, trying to just not experience my emotions, and that can lead to numbing behaviors. Sometimes it can lead to reenacting traumas in different ways, and it can lead to dissociation. Dissociation is when the brain kind of starts to check out, or we check out. It's actually a normal function, and sometimes a protective function when stress is overwhelming. Your brain does this thing where you feel like you're not actually there, like maybe you're watching this happen, and this is a common experience with somebody who's been traumatized. People might have an experience of being aware, almost like watching the event happen, but not being fully present, almost like they're in kind of a fog. In extreme cases, this can result in something we call depersonalization or derealization. That's when the person feels like they're not really in their body, or like everything that's happening around them is not really real. Like, you're not really real, my family is not really real, I'm living in some other dimension. And that can be some of the extreme effects of trauma, not just childhood trauma. It often sets people up for what we think of as latent vulnerability. The nervous system in the body is vulnerable to outside effects that can lead to other mental health problems like anxiety, depression, various forms of even personality disorders. The changes in the brain happen in different areas, including the reward center of the brain, the memory systems of the brain, and also the threat systems of the brain. And like I say, it can also be transgenerational. It can go from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. It's really scary to think of the effects of childhood trauma, and the most important thing to recognize is that it does not need to be a life sentence. There is hope. There are effective ways of healing childhood trauma, and when you start to work with a therapist who's trained in trauma and understands the effects, you can actually achieve some tremendous levels of healing. I hope this video was helpful, and I really welcome any kind of questions or comments that you have. If you are looking for help and you're in California, by all means reach out to me at my contact information, and we may be able to work together. And if you're not in California, I can probably point you in some directions to where you can get some help with a properly trained therapist. As always, I appreciate you viewing, and I really appreciate the comments and questions that people submit. And I will talk with you again. Take care.